Thank you. That's better. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm so excited to be here with my old friend, Richard Fidler. We've known each other for a very long time, and I knew him even before I knew him because I saw the Doug Anthony All-Stars when they were playing in Canberra.
You remember me when I had spots, in other words? Yes.
When he was a lad. And it's so exciting to be here. This book is such an accomplishment. It's so much fun. And it's this incredible mosaic of travel stories and history and legends and so many other things, fiction as well. What really fascinated me was, you are, as the host of Conversations, you are Australia's most prominent story whisperer. You get the stories out of people. And this whole book is quoting and talking about the great storytellers of Islam's golden age and the Arabic world and the Islamic world. So what do you see? What do you see about what's your intuition about how they acquired their stories? Because this whole book is full of amazing stories, and we'll get to them, but I want to know how you approached these storytellers.
Weirdly enough, the whole Arabic tradition of storytelling, I think, has to be seen in the context of them being originally desert people. This book comes out of imperial Baghdad when they built the biggest city in the world, population-wise the richest city in the world by far, but they never forgot their desert Bedouin roots. They remind me a lot of the Icelanders that Kari and I wrote about in Sagaland. People who began their storytelling tradition when they were living in a remote part of the world that no one much cared about, that no one really felt like conquering. And so all you have then is stories that connect you together. In the pre-Islamic era, the only thing that was more prized than for men in particular, was above the role of being a warrior, was being a poet. To being a kind of a minstrel, if you like, or a performer, a recorder of histories and family stories that would tell stories around a fire in the deserts, in the part of Arabia, the Hijaz, which is very, very difficult to live in. Likewise, it was for the Vikings living in medieval Iceland, where all you have really to remind you of who you are and where you come from is stories. And so this is something that stayed with the Arabs and the people that spoke the Arabic language long after they became the builders of a mighty empire of the richest city in the world. They never forgot that about themselves. And so there's one poet who has this beautiful line where he said, even though he's a citizen of Baghdad and he's a writer and a poet, and he said, I still have knights and horses and the desert in me. They never wanted to ever forget that about themselves, even as they became rich and powerful beyond belief.
You said, we were discussing this, and you were saying that when you were writing about Constantinople, you hadn't thought to go to the Arab sources about the sieges and so on, because you didn't think there would be anything there. So what led you to write this? What led you to discover the Arabic storytelling tradition? Yeah,
this is a bit embarrassing, actually. Yeah, I saw references in the Arab siege of Constantinople when I was writing Ghost Empire about the events that took place, and there's some references saying, the Arab sources say this and they say that, and I should have chased them down. I really should have, but I imagine they'd be like the Persian sources. For some reason, I thought with the destruction of Baghdad that they would have been destroyed too, like many of the Persian annals and chronicles are. But oh my God. There's this incredible trove of history and anecdote and gossip and geography and travel literature and adventure. And this is, of course, the people who brought to life the 1001 Nights, which we sometimes call the 1001 Arabian Nights. But this is a storytelling tradition that came to them via Persia, by India and then Persia before it arrived in Baghdad. But Baghdad is the focus of the 1001 Nights. So the way I came to it was a really roundabout way, Linda. Like, I was planning to write another book entirely after I finished The Golden Maze, the book about Prague, but that required me to travel and to have an adventure. All my other books are like that. They're histories based around personal experience I've had traveling out to some part of the world, whether it's Iceland or Istanbul or Prague, and we couldn't bloody do it. None of us could. We're all stuck in our homes going for endless walks around the block. I don't live all that far from here, and I was just like walking around the block. Probably all the people here saw me walking around the bloody block. And I couldn't go to the places I needed to go. So I thought, why don't I write about travellers, because I can't travel and we can't travel, and why don't I write about people from a place that I can't go to anyway. And that place, I thought for a bit, maybe I'll revisit the Vikings who went east. And so I found, I looked at the stories of, not many people are really aware that the Vikings not only went to Western Europe, they went to Eastern Europe as well, coming into it round about where St. Petersburg is, and went through the Russian river systems. And doing that, I stumbled on this account, written by an Arabic traveller by the name of Ibn Fadlan. And he had a story, this harrowing story, of how he was sent by the Caliph of Baghdad, al-Muqtadir, on a mission to go out of Baghdad with a bunch of people to make a treaty with the king somewhere in modern-day Russia, near the city of Kazan. And he wrote this account of his voyage, which is a real heart of darkness story with a bit of wake and fright thrown in as well. And I was just delighting in this story, because to begin with, it's really funny. Like, Ibn Fadlan is very, very funny. He goes out into the world, and he's on this mission from the Caliph, and he's this sophisticated and slightly prissy urbanite. He's like a real cafe latte drinker, this guy. He's quite correct in his moral habits, and he goes out into the world, and along the way he meets these nomads, and he treats them like total bogans along the way.
And he's also, I mean, the thing about, I was going to bring it up later, but I think, you know, this book has so many amazing stories, and it has a lot of violent stories and a lot of crazy deaths and everything else. But I think the thing that's traumatized me the most, and that will never leave my brain, thank you very much, is what he told us, what he told us about Viking hygiene.
Yeah.
I would like you to tell everybody else so that they can suffer as I have.
Oh yeah, yeah. So Ibn Fadlan goes through this terrible ordeal, going through the Caucasus, between the Caspian Sea and the Aral Sea. It's terribly bleak and cold. He accepts the hospitality of these Turkish tribes, and there's one very amusing moment where he accepts the hospitality of this chieftain in his tent, and he's sitting there with the chieftain sitting there with his wife, and he's having this polite, very conventional conversation. And the chieftain's wife suddenly pushes aside her skirts and starts scratching at her fully exposed groin, just scratching away at it, because she's got some, I don't know, insects or something, or lice or whatever. And Ibn Fadlan is this incredibly correct Muslim, and he said, all I could do, he says, was bury my face in my hands and go, God forgive me, God forgive me, God forgive me. And the husband goes, yeah, you prissy Arabs, you think this is cheap behaviour, but anyone tries to go near my wife and I kill them, whereas you let anyone sleep with your wives. And he goes, oh my God, this is a nightmare. So he eventually gets, so he's just like, oh God, I'm just, this is all too much. He arrives on the Volga River at this kingdom. He's supposed to be treating with, and the king that's there. And then a party of Vikings arrive. Now they're still pagan, these Vikings. And they arrive in long ships, and they set up trading stalls to sell furs and skins. And at first, Ibn Fadlan, I got this powerful sense of him being gay as well, because he sees these Viking men and he goes, oh my God, they're so beautiful. These Viking men, they're just so tall, this blonde red hair, they've got these amazing tattoos, incredible jewellery, they're so powerfully built, oh my God, they're so beautiful. And then the next morning, he sees their morning ablutions. And this is how it goes.
This is the one.
Put your drinks down, folks, for this one. This is the Vikings' ablutions in the morning. The chieftain is handed a bowl by a slave. He takes a sip from it. He dips his comb in it, brushes his hair. He ejects whatever mucus is in his nose into the bowl. And then he passes it on to the next guy, who takes a drink from it, dips his comb in it, brushes his hair, snots into it, and then he passes it on to the next guy. And it's, I don't know, it's a bit like one of those big British families all sharing the same bathwater. You wouldn't want to be the guy on the end of that queue, just quietly, I think. And so he goes, oh, these people are disgusting, that's just horrible. Then, oh my God, they defecate in public and have sex with their slaves. Oh, this is unthinkable. But then things get very, very bad after that. Much, much, much worse.
Yes, that's the easy bit, but that is very traumatizing, I think. I think what we can do is, because this does start, it has a wonderful way of starting with the beginning of the caliphate and then going to the end of the great, golden age of Islam. Why don't you read a little bit from page 99?
Sure.
To give us a taste, I'm not having fun with this microphone, to give us a taste of what the book feels like and sounds like.
Should I set it up a little bit too about how we get from 0 to 100 with the Arabs coming out of... So the Arabs in the 5th century, 6th century were a kind of despised people living in a land that was considered by the two great empires nearby, the Romans and the Persians, to be uninhabitable and not worth their bother. They said, oh, the Arabs are kind of a very marginal people to both these great empires who call themselves the two eyes of the world, full of majesty and might. And when I say Roman Empire, I mean the later Roman Empire, where the capital is Constantinople. And it's a kind of an eastward-facing empire. And you have the Sassanid Persians, who are based in the city, the majestic city of Ctesiphon on the river Tigris, not far from modern-day Baghdad today. And they kind of despise the Arabs. And then in the very short period of time, the Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula are united under the leadership of Muhammad, the Prophet. They receive the words of the Quran, which becomes the first work of Arabic literature. They unite the peninsula, and then after Muhammad's death, his successors, the first caliphs, they start to test the borders of the Roman and Persian Empire, just for raiding purposes, to keep the tribes united. But the thing is, the Romans and the Persians have just been through this harrowing war, which it looked like the Persians were about to win, then the Romans came right back. And after 20 years of this harrowing warfare, they're just completely hollowed out empires. And so when the Arab raiders, the Bedouin raiders, go up to the borders of the Persian and Roman empires just north of them, there's no one guarding the borders. There's no one in the forts. And very quickly, raiding turns into conquest. And within a very short period of time, bang, they take half the Roman Empire. They take the province of Egypt, Palestine, Syria, and the northern African provinces, just like that. And then they take all the Persian Empire, going all the way right into Central Asia, and in no time they have the biggest empire the world has ever seen. They're flush with money, and they move their capital after the Abbasid Revolution from Damascus to Baghdad, a purpose-built city that was so staggeringly beautiful. Only Constantinople rivaled it. And the high point of this time, of this period, that's often referred to as the Golden Prime, was under the Caliph Haroon al-Rashid. Any people here read the 1001 Nights, 1001 Arabian Nights, or remember it from their childhood? Haroon al-Rashid appears all the time in this as the great Caliph, the handsome Caliph of Baghdad. But he was a real historical figure. How he looked and what he said and did was recorded by the chronicles of the time. So I'll just read this bit. Haroon al-Rashid, tall, good-looking and slim, with wavy hair and olive skin, presided over an empire that stretched from North Africa to India. The English poet Tennyson would later fantasize about the golden prime of good Haroon al-Rashid. And even in Haroon's own time, Muslims could feel the sunshine of God's goodwill on their faces. Did you not see how the sun came out of hiding on Haroon's accession and flooded the world with light? Asked one giddy poet. Haroon was, in all likelihood, the wealthiest man who ever lived, and he spent his riches freely. On his wedding day, he handed out fistfuls of gold and silver coins to people from all over his realm, while his servants distributed brocaded gowns and scented oils from large glass bowls. To his wife, Zubaydah, he gave an ornate sleeveless jacket, a badana, studded with oversized rubies and pearls. So great were the splendours and riches of his reign, wrote the chronicler Al-Masudi, such was its prosperity that this period has been called the honeymoon. When Haroon came to the throne, Baghdad had become the first medieval city to pass the population threshold of 1 million people. In the new districts of Rusafa, Shamasya and Mukharim on the east bank of the Tigris, princes, courtiers and merchants built palaces and mansions that outshone the grandeur of the Golden Gate Palace in the Round City. While in Baghdad, Haroon preferred to dwell in the Qasr al-Khuld, the Palace of Eternity, overlooking the Tigris, a palace so named for its gardens, which was said to rival those in paradise. Here the Caliph could find some respite from the heat of the day and the pressures of court life, sitting in the shaded pavilions of an immense flowered pleasure garden, surrounded by waterfalls and trees with precious gems studded into their trunks. The palace interiors facing the gardens had been decorated to subtly correspond with the colours blooming outside. One visitor later recalled entering an audience hall carpeted with pink fabric and attended by servants in matching pink silks, which looked out over the treetops of a garden that had burst into leaf with roses and peach and apple blossoms. So that gives you a picture of the splendour, thank you very much, of Baghdad at its extraordinary prime.
And with this also came a tremendous civilization of art and architecture, and they really, really loved reading. The storytelling, when paper and bookbinding and all of this began to be popular, it was truly one of the great book empires, wasn't it?
Yes.
And sorry.
I was just going to say that there was a great battle in the year 750, just before Baghdad was founded. Probably it's something I think you wrote about it in your own book, Linda. It's the only battle of this empire between China, the Chinese, and the Arabs of the time. Both great powers were drawn into a fight in Central Asia by the provinces there in modern-day Afghanistan. And they were sort of drawn into it, really. They were manipulated into fighting on behalf of their proxies. The Arabs of the Abbasid forces won a stunning victory, and there was a legend that said that some Chinese prisoners of war were brought to Baghdad afterwards, and these were paper makers, and they taught the secret of paper making to the Arabs. More likely, the kind of knowledge just sifted in through Central Asia. It just sort of came across almost by osmosis. But the great flourishing of Arab maths and science and astronomy and poetry comes from these several factors, three factors that happened all at the same time in the middle of the 8th century. The first one was the arrival of paper. Paper technology meant that they could put aside unreliable papyrus. Papyrus, you can write on it and easily erase it, but paper is softer, it absorbs the ink, and is much, much harder to create forgeries with. And you can also, if you stack paper in a pile, you can bind it along one side and turn it into a codex or a normal book like this, which is much easier to use and much easier to access information from than a scroll, for example. So the first thing was paper technology. The second thing was a new form of Arabic script, a new kind of cursive script, which was much quicker to write and allowed people to write much more quickly across the page and create books. And the third thing was the arrival of Indian numbers. These are the numbers the whole world uses today. We use them here in this country. We call them Arabic numbers, but really they're from India. But because they were introduced into Europe from the Arabic countries, we call them Arabic numbers, but really they were invented in India. And I can't tell you what a breakthrough that was compared to Roman numerals that had been used before then, as anyone who has tried to divide MCXX1V into equal portions of DLV111 will know. So suddenly mathematics becomes something that's really quick and easy to perform. You can write really easily, and you have this cheap, mass-produced substance like paper, and suddenly there's an explosion of books everywhere. Baghdad becomes this gigantic city of books. Whole districts of the city are given over to selling books and creating books.
And one of the remarkable things about that was that they translated so many classics, Greek and Roman and Indian classics, and preserved them. I mean, they through the Dark Ages. It was very much to their credit. And I have to note, as somebody who does translation, you write here that the translators of the ancient classics became among the most highly remunerated professionals in the empire, paid, it was said, the weight of their books in gold. I mean, basically, I get paid the weight of my books in aluminium foil, but, you know.
Yes, the most highly paid people in medieval imperial Baghdad were not hedge fund managers. They were poets and translators, Linda, and we need to move to that kind of society once more, folks. I mean, I don't have nothing personal against hedge fund managers, but if they and all of corporate HR just sort of disappeared off the face of the earth tomorrow, I think we'd be all right. I think we'd be okay. But poets and translators, we need them desperately, and more of them.
Absolutely. But they did have people who we would also recognize very much as from our day. You describe, there's a hilarious passage about probably a particularly inert bureaucrat. And I thought, oh God, they must work at Centrelink or the FOI. Because it's this wonderful description in here, and it ends with this fantastic thing that before the reply to the original request could be dispatched, canals would have burst, breaches in the irrigation system would have widened, the Bedouin would have carried off the crops, or some other catastrophe would have happened which rendered the reply useless.
Yes, that's right. That's kind of towards the end of the Abbasid great era of Abbasid greatness. But the truth is that one of the key reasons for their success was their ability to build these stunning, impressive and efficient bureaucracies. This is the key to empire, folks. You can have a great army that can run over half the world, but unless you've got these big bureaucratic institutions to manage them, you lose it within less than a generation. And so very early on in the caliphate, the early caliphs built these institutions which were known as diwans or divans, and they would sit on these long seats like you have here today to meet with officials, and this is where we get the word divan from, as a long seat you sit on in order to meet some high official in a waiting room. These bureaucracies for centuries were very effective, very good at what they did. They were often run by Persians. Persian Zoroastrian traditions were Zoroastrian Persian managers from what had been the Sassanid Persian Empire. Many of them converted to Islam and became the great managers of these bureaucratic enterprises in Baghdad.
You know, I was talking about your book to a very good friend of mine who's a Palestinian Muslim, and I was reading to her some of the translations of the love poetry, and she's very well educated. She grew up in the Middle East. She said, oh my God, I don't know these. And I was telling her some of the stories that you've told about the caliphates, and she says, oh my God, I don't know any of this. And then she sort of drew a breath and she said, but can you tell me, what's his attitude towards Islam? And I said, I think he's totally fascinated and admiring of Islamic civilization. And then I thought, well, why don't I ask you? Because this is a book about the golden age of Islam, the caliphates and all of that. So how would you have answered her?
I've kept away from observations about modern Islam. That's out of my wheelhouse, that is. I need to do a lot more reading before I would venture a comment on that. And I think plenty of people have had plenty to say about the state of modern Islam. I've written instead about the golden age of Islam and what came out of it. I have to say, I love civilizations. I'm just drawn to them. I'm drawn to their stories. I find the grandeur of this civilization, the curiosity of its leaders kind of fabulous. The willingness to find out as much about the world as they possibly could. This was all of a piece with Islam for them. On the back cover, there's the words, go about the earth and look. This is a very oft repeated phrase in the Quran. It's a kind of a repeated commandment. It's saying, well, you know, I can tell you this, you need to go about the earth and look, go and see for yourself. And there are all sorts of stories about the Prophet who would say the Prophet Muhammad was said to have said, seek knowledge even as far as China.
And they did.
And they did. They absolutely did. So I found in this period, though, it's all tied up with imperialism, which is all very human. And in many ways, the people of this time reminded me of the British in the 19th century or Americans in the 20th century. They are the commanders of the world. They have the best ideology in religion. They're so obviously and manifestly successful. They've got so much money, so much wealth, so much influence and power. The whole world has been sort of laid at their feet. There's a sense of manifest destiny about them that allows them to feel generous about how they go about the earth and look. And one thing has to be absolutely said about this period is how one historian said, Islam talked itself into the Middle East and to the wider world at this time. It didn't fight its way into the world. Yes, there are the Arabic conquests, the Muslim conquests, but these were conquests to establish political authority, not to force people kicking and screaming into Islam. In fact, the way it would work is that once the Muslims conquered a territory like Egypt, they would arrive, they were a tiny religious minority, they'd say, you have to accept the authority of our caliph, and once you do that, we'll leave you alone, we'll leave your property alone, you can go to your church, you can go to your temple, we're not going to get in the way of that. You will have to pay a special tax called a jizya, which, quite frankly, a lot of these people in these newly conquered territories found less onerous than Roman or Persian taxation. But other than that, we'll leave you alone. You can go about your business. We're not going to give you a hard time. And this created an economic incentive for caliphs to encourage people not to convert to Islam, because they had this huge revenue stream from other people of the book who were not believers in Islam, from Christians and Jews, and to a lesser extent Zoroastrians as well. So there was a feeling that you really ought not to drag people to the religion. You let them come of their own accord. And quite frankly, many historians, and I'm convinced of this myself, this is the reason why Islam and how Islam became so well established in North Africa, in the Middle East, and Central Asia.
And there's one, and when they were supposed to go out and look into the world, sometimes they were sent on missions. And one of the really interesting missions was to find out about whether the wall of Gog and Magog, the Alexander the Great's supposed wall, which kept in this kind of monstrous, crazy kingdom, that was a mission that somebody had to make. But what happens when the reporter isn't a reliable witness?
Well, this is kind of fun, this story. This is the most enjoyable part of the book. I've divided the chapter. It sort of follows a chronological line from the beginnings of the rise of the Muslims to the fall of Baghdad, but it's also divided into 4 directions to mirror the 4 compass points on the 4 cardinal points on the compass, which correspond to the 4 gates of Baghdad: north, south, east, and west. And this is the East chapter, and like I said, this is the most fun one to write. Pretty much the Jews, Christians, Muslims all believed, this is a commonly held thing in the Middle Ages, the early Middle Ages, that somewhere far to the east, far in the Badlands of the northeast of the world, there was the race of apocalypse beasts called the race of Gog and Magog. And they lived behind the wall of Gog and Magog. And it was believed that this wall, penning them in, had been built by Alexander the Great. This was commonly said at the time, and the story of this is even in the Quran, where Alexander the Great is identified as the two-horned one. And so the story goes that Alexander was coming through the area. The local people said, "Oh my God, we're being tormented by these awful monsters here, the monsters of Gog and Magog." And he says, "Well, we're going to build a wall. We're going to make these metal bricks, and we're going to build it between 2 mountains, as high as the mountain tops. The rest of the mountains enclosed, the monsters, they'll stay behind there, and it's all done." The monsters are kept behind this great big high fence, this big gigantic metal wall. And the problem with that is, it also says in the Quran, and it's understood in apocalyptic literature for the Christians and Jews, is that the day will come one day when that wall breaks, and the monsters of Gog and Magog will race through, overrun the holy cities of the earth, and that will be the end of the world. So one morning, the Caliph Watik in the 9th century had a dream. He had a dream the wall was broken. And this had the tone of prophecy to him, or some kind of ominous thing. So he sent this expedition east to see if the wall of Gog and Magog was still standing. And the account of this is written in a book, which is where I got my title from, the Book of Roads and Kingdoms. This expedition was led by a man called Salam the Interpreter, who was believed to be able to speak 30 different languages. And the account of his journey is kind of fun, Linda, because he begins with, first of all, we went out through Iran, through the city of Ray, we went up into the Caucasus, we went to Tiflis, which we all know is the modern city of Tbilisi in Georgia. Then it gets all very vague. He said, then our expedition entered a black and putrid land. We passed through that land and then came into the cities that had been ruined by Gog and Magog. And after some unspecified long ordeal period of time, we arrived in this town called Yimu, and from there we get to the wall, and we found the wall of Gog and Magog. And the way Salam describes it, it's just like it is in the Quran. This big high wall of metal bricks, and it's all standing, everything's tickety-boo. He meets he says he meets with the garrison troops that are there to keep an eye on it. They say, "Oh yeah, we go out every week. A bunch of us go up to the gates. We sort of hammer it with a hammer and go bang, bang, bang on the wall. And if we hear this kind of coming from behind it, we know they're all still there and it's all fine." Salam's convinced it's all terrific. He scrapes off some iron filings to prove that he's been there, puts it in a handkerchief, goes back to Baghdad and says it's all fine. commander of the faithful, it's all nothing to worry about. Now, this was thought to have been for a very long time a wonder tale, one of those kind of great Sinbad-y type adventures that people in the Middle Ages just loved. You know, we went to this strange place. A black and putrid land. North of the Caspian Sea is the Karakum Desert, which is famous for its black shale, sand, shale sand, and for its intense methane deposits. This is where there is what's known as the gateway to hell. Sometime in the 70s, the Soviets, it's now in modern day Uzbekistan, built a big gas platform, and the wonders of Soviet engineering meant the whole thing just fell into the hole, this whole gas platform, and they went, oh, what are we going to do with that? I go, oh no, we'll just burn off the excess gas and set fire to it. It's still blazing today, 50 years later, and it's kind of like a tourist attraction now. It's called the Gateway to Hell. Black and putrid land, methane gas deposits, black sand. Then he said we came into the ruined cities of Gog and Magog. Now, this takes us into the Taklamakan Desert, where I had no knowledge of this until I looked into it. There are all these ghost cities in the middle of one of the harshest deserts on the earth, the Taklamakan Desert. These ghost cities that were Buddhist cities built in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries that were run by these that were fed by the oasis cities, fed by these streamlets going through the Taklamakan Desert. But then the streams changed course, the cities were no longer viable, everyone left, and the desert buried them. But in the 20th century, they were uncovered, and they were full of these beautiful cities, ghost cities of stunning Buddhist statues. Now, where did Salam the Interpreter go? This is more than a few people have had the supposition that what he actually saw when he went all that way far east was the westernmost reaches of the Great Wall of China, the Han Wall.
They were not metal.
They were not metal. They're nothing like the way they're described in the Quran. They're heaps of matted luwai weeds. Like, this is ingenious. Like, that's all they can build. There are no stones to build the Great Wall out in that desert. So the Jade Gate is out there, but they're made out of heaps of matted luwai weeds. But you know, Linda, if you're on a mission from the Caliph, it says go out and find the wall of Gog and Magog, and you go out there and you see these kind of heaps of these dried vegetable matter between stone gateposts, along a train of them going, you go, well, that's close enough. You go back to Samarra, go back to Iraq, and you go, yeah, Your Majesty, I've been out there. It's all like it is in the Quran. I mean, who's going to be the one to say to the Caliph, it's not quite like it says it in the Holy Book? So, you know, there's a lot of skepticism about this. He probably didn't go there. Maybe he went there, maybe he didn't. But it's kind of fun to hypothesize. And then there's the book I've written has got the other side of the story about the European and American archaeologists who came into that part of the world, like Sir Mark Orrell-Stein, who identified the Jade Gate and the Great Han Great Wall, but then who ended up looting the area of some of its greatest Buddhist treasures.
Yeah. It's so interesting. So there's so many great histories that are written. There are so many great records of customs of different lands and everything else. And yet there are these little escapes into, you know, unreality or fantasy. And it really interests me that you've chosen to bookend your account with two fantastic tales. You open the book by saying, here's a recipe for invisibility.
Yes, my opening line is, this is how you become invisible. Anyone can do this.
You just need a dead cat and a couple of 14-year-olds and...
Yeah, I think there's a feeling of people in the Middle Ages, whether it's in Christian Europe or Byzantium or in the Abbasid Empire, they're all looking for enchantment. And the world was full of enchantment for them, for the Indians as well and for the Chinese. The world felt like this marvelous and strange place which enchants you. This is before Google Maps had sort of marked every last square centimetre of territory on the face of the earth. There was a feeling like you could get into a boat or on the back of a camel and ride out to the distant horizon and meet and see incredibly strange things. And it feels like to me we've been putting that further and further away. This is why we need science fiction. We know that the Earth isn't full of people with no heads, with faces on their torsos, or giant birds, or talking elephants and what have you. So we imagine that maybe they were on the planet Mars. Well, now there's nothing on bloody Mars, is there? So I talked to an astronomer once who said, oh God, I'm really hoping the Titan probe reveals that under the icy surface of Titan there's all these alien fish. And I thought, oh, that'd be so cool. There's no alien fish. Well, not that we know of. But so we keep having to push this boundary. We still want the world to be enchanting to us. So this is the age we live in, an age of disenchantment.
And is that why you have wrapped the book in 2 tales of enchantment?
Yes.
Because you start with this fantastic description of how to become invisible, and you end it with the last 3 chapters of the 1001 Nights.
Yeah, that's a lovely tale. I just found that just funnily enough, at the end of writing about the book. Towards the end of the 1001 Nights, there's no canonical version of this, by the way. It's just a heap of stories, really, that originated in India, came to the Arabian world through Persia. And they just picked up more and more stories along the way. But I end my book with the story of the travels of Tufa the slave singer. Slave singers were such a thing in the Abbasid Empire, in medieval Baghdad. Slave singers had this whole honoured role. They had enormous power but had no power at the same time. They were women. They performed a role, something between like a high poet and a geisha. This was the hard thing for me, Linda, in writing about women in this book. Most, of course, all the medieval societies are very patriarchal. But you can still, if you stand still enough in the midst of the history, you can sort of hear their voices. It's harder with the Abbasid Empire, of course, because of the segregation of women into their own world of the harem. And so, having done that though, having segregated the women, the high women of the families of these courts, these powerful men found they missed women's company. And so there was a whole culture of creating slave singers. Talented little girls who were talented with music and poetry were sent off to Medina in Arabia and trained in music theory and practice and history. And they were then purchased as slaves in the courts of very powerful men and in the courts of the caliphs as well. And they were expected to sit there drinking wine with the men and entertain them with their witty riposts. And often they were savagely witty as well, and the men kind of seemed to enjoy that. And bits of verse were exchanged backwards and forwards. But the genius that you don't hear their voices firsthand because they're not, the documents that they might have written or write are not there. You see them through the eyes of the men who were enchanted by them or infuriated by them. So you sort of have to see them through that lens. You can hear them from behind the wall of that, Linda. But clearly they were incredibly powerful figures in their own right. And like I say, and yet they weren't. Being slaves, slave singers, no one was allowed to have sex with them except their masters. But nonetheless, they had to consent to that, to their masters. But they are revered in so much of the literature, these women, as the way we revere our greatest female authors in the Western canon as well. They were like, oh my God, this woman, she's a stunning poet, and this is genius. And so the final story is a story of a slave singer who's based on a real woman, Tufa the slave singer, and how she enchanted Haroon al-Rashid.
Now, there's so much to get into, and I mean, I was even thinking the other women that we see who are really powerful, they're usually the mothers of a caliph or something like that. And the only single women who are powerful are powerful sorceresses.
Yes, that's right.
And so this is quite interesting, but it was quite frustrating not to be able to see the women as clearly, and I know you felt that completely.
Yeah, I did. But writing my first book, Ghost Empire, of course, women are very much in the background, but some women just come, bang, they just sort of arrive on the scene. Mentally in my mind, when I'm trying to write history, I sort of send out a mental invitation to the cosmos. I'm saying, look, of course the men are doing all the talking here at the moment. I want to have this meeting in, the White Bay Beer Company on a Thursday night. Interesting women of history, I want you to show up, bring a bottle of brandy with you or something like that, and tell me what's really going on. It's a way of, I'm sure you try to do this too, Linda. You sit still and you just try and hear it. You try and hear these voices and try and keep an eye out for these extraordinary women. And the women who do succeed under these heavily patriarchal situations, they're nearly always remarkable women of genius. They've somehow figured a way around it. It's harder to do that in the Abbasid Empire. It's just harder to do that. But nonetheless, as you say, some of these great women come forward. There was a role for great ladies once they'd passed menopause and they were rich and powerful enough and the mother of someone great like a caliph, well then they were often revered, like Shaghab, the mother of one of the caliphs, and Zubaydah as well. So it depends. It was hard with this, but I still found some extraordinary women nonetheless.
You certainly did. We're going to open this up to questions, and Dan has a roving mic. Dan is there. So put up your hand and he'll come to you, and I will be repeating the question for the live stream as well.
For the 19 million people following, hanging on our every word in this live stream. Hello.
Hello. I'm lucky enough to have heard you and Richard Glover tonight, so I've had 4 seeds and a dead cat. Am I invisible?
Do you want me to read the recipe?
Well, I thought I just read
you haven't quite got there. There's a bit more to do.
Am I invisible?
You are not invisible. I can see you. No. You've got to grow. It takes months to get this right. You don't just become invisible tomorrow, buddy. Like you got to get a dead cat with no eyes, but it's got to be a cat that's died of its own accord. You can't kill the cat. And this is why I actually think the whole recipe is a prank, by the way. I think it's a prank by Masudi. We have a lady just down the front here. A bit closer? Yeah, thank you.
Saying about stories with regards to India and Persia, etc. Is that any link to the Aboriginal stories?
The question is the stories of India and Persia and so on. Is there a link to Aboriginal? Is there a similarity to Aboriginal stories?
I think like Aboriginal culture, there is, yes, of course, in any pre-literate societies which don't have a written language, then you are going to have this powerful oral tradition where people remember things by rote. The Vikings were like that too. This powerful oral tradition where things are remembered word for word and passed down from generation to generation. But there's another kind of connection I found in the course of writing this book. In the early 1940s, during World War II, there was an Australian airman posted to an island called Marchenbar Island off the coast of Arnhem Land, a guy called Maury Eisenberg. And he was there to man a radar station to warn Australia of incoming enemy Japanese aircraft. And he was fishing on the beach, not too attentive to his post right round the clock, but fishing on the beach one day, and in the sand he found a handful of very old coins. Now this is Marchenbar Island, like I say, off the coast of Arnhem Land. He put them in a little matchbox, went home, forgot all about them, rediscovered them in the 1970s, took them to what was then the Sydney Coin Museum and asked to have them identified. And they said, well, you've got some coins here from the Dutch East India Society. They're quite old, but that's not particularly remarkable. We know the Dutch were trading throughout the area. But there are another coins, 3 or so coins here, that are quite remarkable. They're from a place called Kilwa. Kilwa was a medieval Islamic kingdom in East Africa, near Zanzibar. How the hell did those coins get off the coast of Arnhem Lands? Now we know there were Macassan traders and Chinese traders meeting up with Aboriginal people in northern Australia, trading for sea cucumber and other things as well. Coins can pass through many hands on the way from one place to another. But holy crap, it's a wonderful way of illustrating the power of these trade routes that were dominated by the Abbasid Empire. They had, just out of Baghdad, there's the city of Basra, and a port city of Persia, Siraf, nearby as well. And from there, thousands and thousands of Arabic ships and Persian ships went out onto the trade routes of the Indian Ocean, which they followed the monsoonal winds down, all the way down the coast of East Africa to Kilwa, where they traded, where Kilwa was a major source of gold and slaves and timber. They went up to what is now Ethiopia, around down through Persia, coming down around the other end of the arc of the Indian Ocean, down through India to Sri Lanka, which they called the island of Serendip, which is where we get the word serendipity from, where they thought that rubies rolled off the sides of the mountains down there. From there, they'd often loop around through the Spice Islands, which were quite dangerous in those days, through what is now, the Straits of Malacca near Singapore, and shoot up past Vietnam up to the thriving cities of Guangzhou, which were major, gigantic port cities in the 9th and 10th centuries. So traders were coming from the Muslim world, were coming through that area all the time. Shipwrecks have been found in Belitung in Indonesia. So there is a kind of, there are indications, there are the tiniest bits of evidence that there's a cultural and trade connection there between what were Aboriginal people in Northern Australia and perhaps traders that came from as far away as East Africa.
You were mentioning earlier how travel and being in these places is so vital to your process. I'm interested in how you dealt with the distance and the research process for this book, and how it must have been drastically different, and who you had helpers or on the ground.
I had help from my wife, who's a librarian, but mostly I just burrowed. I did a lot of burrowing into libraries and into the internet, into the furthest reaches of the internet. And as Linda said, I was kind of embarrassed to see this trove of information and history, and the quality of it is so good too. The great historian is a man named Al-Tabari, who wrote 36 volumes of history, which starts at the beginning of the world and ends at the Caliphate just before the time of his life. And he writes these really candid, bracing histories where he can, and he's careful to say they have this own way of footnoting their work, these scholars. There's footnoting, and they do it by saying, someone said to someone, 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 this. And that they're able to go back. So they follow what they call in the hadiths, the sayings of the Prophet, they call that isnads, these chains of evidence, which is so much more rigorous than any other histories. I don't know if the Chinese annals are like that, Linda, if they're careful to show the chain of information transmission.
That's a really interesting question. I think there's some of that, but I don't know that it's like so-and-so said to so-and-so said to so-and-so all the way back.
Yeah.
But I love the details in this. I think that some of the Chinese histories are more focused on official things that happened. I mean, the details that you obviously delight in. We find this a male musician called the Blackbird, or nicknamed the Blackbird, and he happened also to have invented antiperspirant, and he had a mullet.
Yeah.
And this is the kind of detail that's just, when I was writing my history of China, I would have died for this kind of detail.
Yeah, like the histories that I found, the volume after volume of the stuff is often quite sober in the case of Al-Tabari, and he's kind of like really frank, how people really screwed up here. Like, it's really honest when it's really honourable history. But then my favourite historian was a guy called Al-Masudi. Masudi, for whom I get the recipe for the potion for invisibility from. He was a man who was he was probably the most widely travelled man in the world of his time. He sailed and travelled everywhere, on boat, by camel, by horse. He went all around Africa. He went into Europe. He went to Constantinople. He went to China. He went to India and wrote this voluminous, wonderful work that has the most beautiful title. It's called Meadows of Gold and Mines of Gems. And his histories, he's full of history as well of the caliphs. And it's so gossipy and charming and funny and bawdy and witty and poignant and all these things. It's incredibly rich. It's one of the great privileges of writing this book was to encounter a great writer like Al-Masudi, who I'd never heard of, and I guess probably not a lot of people here tonight would have heard of. How wonderful it was to have that during COVID lockdown, when you can't go out and meet people, meet this great, fabulous, amazing person who was almost certainly the greatest conversationalist of his age, who died 1,000 years ago.
Yeah. We've got another question here.
Hello.
Yeah, thank you. So first, I guess I'd like to. It'd be wonderful to have a reverse of the interviewer and interviewee. I think that would be a really fascinating episode. So whether it's conversation things or not. But
Oh, you mean me as the guest?
no,
No.
you as the interviewer.
Yeah.
Linda as the
Oh no, I did a wonderful interview with Linda about her shortest history of China, which is a knockout, by the way. And that's on the. No, don't go to the Conversations website at the moment. It's a bloody mess, thanks to the. I don't know. Every time that's in the podcast feed. You can find that there. Google our names and it'll pop up. Yeah. I've also got another long interview with Linda about her experience in China throughout the 1980s, culminating in the catastrophe of Tiananmen Square in '89.
Yeah, I think we've done 3 actually.
Yeah, we've done 3.
I think over the years, but
Good question.
yeah.
So I guess the question might be for both of you then. Obviously looking at how that community or that society moved and evolved and moved out from Baghdad and travelled across the world, you must have, or you might have reflected on what the contemporary analogousness is today, and what do you see as analogous to that type of movement and that type of understanding, that type of travel and that type of engagement as society goes out, and it's also it's not necessarily benign perhaps as some people said, but in other ways for so many of us who travel to see the world, it is wondrously benign.
What the thing that are
contemporary reflections.
Sure. The thing that these accounts reminded me most of was the British in the 19th century. The way they went out to the world thinking, well, we're the best country in the world. Everyone says so. We're the most powerful empire the world has ever seen. It's we have all the money, the wealth. We have the best parliamentary system, the greatest freedoms. We're rich beyond belief. Everyone in the world wants to be like us, and who can blame them? So there's that kind of confidence, imperial confidence, that's there, but also mixed with a curiosity of the wider world. There's a wonderful account I had, and I've got this in my Prague book as well. The earliest description we have of the city of Prague comes from an emissary of the Emir of Cordoba, who was actually a Jew. He was Jewish rather than a Muslim, who was nonetheless conducting business on behalf of the Emir of Cordoba. And he goes into Prague, and he's a bit like a British anthropologist in a safari suit and a pith helmet. He sort of walks around and he goes, well, it's marvellous what you've got going on in here in this Prague, you call it, do you? Tremendous what you're doing over here. You've got a slave market, jolly good, that's marvellous. Oh, that's pretty interesting. Oh, yes, and you've got a thing that looks like what we call a sauna, I suppose, because he describes the sauna they have. He says it's a city of limestone and marble. It's nice, and it's marvellous, and then he moves on to the next place. So there is that kind of sense of confidence and curiosity. The kind of voice you sometimes hear when you read Watkin Tench, the British officer who came with the First Fleet, who was curious about Aboriginal people. Yes, he is part of this invading colonial power, but nonetheless that's mixed with the curiosity, a genuine curiosity, and even it can be said a respect, I think, of the people that they're encountering.
And I would add that I'm not sure that we have anything today, because the conquering, I think that age is more or less done, but soft power, the notion of soft power, the whole thing in this book is and this was true of the Tang dynasty and many periods in China as well. People flocked to these places. They looked to these places as incredible centers of learning and of culture and of art and of fashion and everything else. And this is something that I think to some extent the United States has done, the American soft power of Hollywood and all that, but that's kind of falling apart a little bit now, not completely, but you have that sort of, people are very much into American films still and American TV and all of that, but the Americans, for their part, aren't as curious about the rest of the world. So there's many, and the Chinese are very desperate to extend their civilization and their, project the glorious culture and so on, and they're not succeeding very well. Their soft power rankings, there is such a thing, is going down and down, especially since Xi Jinping came in 10 years ago. So it's a really interesting question, but I don't know.
When you think of Baghdad in the 9th century, think of Paris in the 1890s, think of New York in the 1920s, this place that everyone wants to go to where the action is. That's where the action is, and it's where the most fun is to be had.
Just a quick question then. Have we lost that curiosity?
Have we lost that curiosity?
No, we haven't lost the curiosity, no.
Because of our ability to travel so immediately through our screens, have we abdicated our travel curiosity?
Have we lost our travel curiosity?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so at all. I mean, I've just managed to get a flight to New York in January, and barely by the skin of my teeth, the whole country has made travel plans after being stuck at home for 3 years. Maybe that's a hangover from COVID, but I don't think we're any less willing to. And maybe in fact, there's too much of us all over the world. Whole cities are being overrun by Airbnb. You can't get across the bloody Charles Bridge in Prague without running into half of mainland China and 900 million Americans as well. So maybe there's almost too much travel going on in the world these days, which is fine for me, but not for anyone else.
I think we have time for like one more question.
Very simple one. Richard, this time in the 8th century, they consider the world to be flat or round, and this limit their extended travel.
That's a really good question. They knew the world to be round. There's a wonderful story in my book of the most learned of the caliphs, Balmain, who had read in Ptolemy, he'd read the Greek scientist Ptolemy, that who measured the circumference of the earth. And he thought, well, I can read this in this ancient Greek book, but I think I want to find out for myself and confirm it. So he sent out these 3 inventors he knew in Baghdad, these famous inventors, the Banu Musa, the brothers Musa. And they went out to the desert, they set out pegs, and they travelled, and using their whatever sextants they had, I think, they waited for the pole star to drop 1 degree and measured how far it was, and they arrived at exactly the same figure as Ptolemy. And they went, now we know the circumference of the earth is, I think the measurement was 24,000 miles. That's just off the top of my head. And it's within about 2% just out from the true figure. They came up with a pretty close figure. So yes, they knew the world was round, and getting on a bit in time, they had the best map makers in the world. They created a map maker named Al-Adrisi, who was working for a Christian king in Sicily, created this astonishing map of the whole of Eurasia, which I think has Iceland in one corner, the wall of Gog and Magog in another corner. It's actually written on the map, and Southeast Asia and China are in another corner as well. So they had these very advanced, the most advanced maps in the world, and they knew the world was round, but they had no concept of America.
We have one more question over here, Steve. Can we just do that? And then this is the final question, because we want to get...
Sorry, you've had your question. Can you pass...
No. Oh, no, the question...
No, the question's behind you.
Behind you.
It's okay.
Oh.
Maybe 2 very quick questions.
Are you a question hog, sir?
Yes, you're...
But go ahead, please, yes.
Very quick. Very quick. We want to get Richard to the signing table.
Jared Diamond with his stuff, and Noah Hariri, they don't really talk about why the Islamic or the Arabic culture did not take over. They talk about why Europe took over. What's your opinion on that?
It did take over. It absolutely did take over. It was the biggest empire. It sort of extended beyond any kind of rational boundaries that anyone could possibly administer for the Middle Ages. And it stood up for a very long while, and of course those cultures are still there from North Africa. Islam is still there from North Africa, Arabs are still across North Africa, but Islam of course extends not only into Central Asia, but going down, of course, into what is now Pakistan, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and So no, it's I think by anyone's standards, it's done pretty well. Yeah. Okay, Stephen.
One more final quick question.
I was just going to say, having written the book, how ripped off do you feel about your education in history? You nailed it with the fact that they worked out the world was round, and we were taught in school that we didn't work that out until the 14 or 1500s. And that all our notions of discovery were very Eurocentric notions of discovery. Yet here were these people pressing as far as the western limits of the wall of China, etc. And the other question I want to ask is that to what degree were the Chinese and the Indians, you say the Indians gave us a number system, the Arabs claimed credit for it. Was that because of their influence, their interaction with Indians? Or whether or not the Indians themselves and the Chinese themselves were pressing west? Was that same level of inquisitiveness occurring in those cultures?
Well, the first question about. Sorry, did you want to say something?
You do the first.
All right. The first question about was I ripped off? Well, to some degree. I mean, we're all in my school years. I think the common wisdom was that after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, there was a dark age. And yes, certainly in Western Europe there was a dark age. There was what one historian calls a radical simplification of material society, which means they become a lot poorer and dumber and more illiterate. The aqueducts break down, all of that. But this was not a dark age for the vast majority of people living across this vast landmass. At this time, in the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, this for people living in Byzantium, in Arabia, in Persia, in China, in India, in these parts of the world, it's a time of quickening. It's a time when the pulse starts to race, when there are burgeoning gigantic cities that are sending trade missions to one another all the time, where knowledge, money, luxury goods are all being exchanged. Mighty empires are rising up, building fabulous cities. This is like living in New York in the 1920s. You get this sense of something's going on here that's massive and cultured, and there's so much money, power and excitement, conquest, blood and horror and everything else. So yeah, no dark age there at all. That's quite a misnomer. But the second thing there about the influence of India, a lot of it, from my understanding, came through Persia. So it had seeped into Sassanid Persian culture when they were still Zoroastrian before they became Muslim. And then all that Persian expertise came into Baghdad, and they were the great managers of the empire at the time and the great tastemakers as well. So it came through there, but then more directly as well. But having said that, India for the Abbasids was like Narnia. They wrote all sorts of stories. India was the land where fantastical things happened. It was full of giant birds, elephants that could count money at a market stall and would smash the stall if they got shortchanged. People who were part fish and part human. India was this fabulous land where incredible things took place for largely in the tales of the Abbasids. We really, it's getting quite late. Okay.
Zoroastrians went to India.
The Zoroastrians went to India.
Yes, that's true. Yes, that's right. Yes.
And they became the bureaucrats.
Yes, and they became the bureaucrats.
Indeed.
And there's a lot of rich interaction between the Arabs and the Chinese throughout all of this time.
Through the Silk Roads. Yes.
Through the Silk Roads and so on, and also up the ports. And actually, just a little note, when you were talking about the great sea voyages and the trading, there were so many Arabic traders in places like Guangzhou and other seaports, and the Chinese had no problem with them, with dealing with them, anything like that. The word foreign devil only came into, as I write in my book, we only get that when the Portuguese arrive and behave really badly. But the Arabs were always, very welcome, and they were very sophisticated, and I think the two cultures interacted quite a lot. But I really
Having said that, the Arab traders in Guangzhou were massacred in this terrible massacre, but that's a whole other story. But that's in my book, of which you should buy two of, because each book is different.
And I think it's in my book as well.
And it's in Linda's book too.
So let's thank Richard so much. Thank you so much for this great conversation and for the great book.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Linda Jaivin. Thank you. Happy to answer questions while signing books too.